If my wife's friends were confident enough to plan my divorce in my own living room, then why did their smiles crack the moment I asked one simple question: how many of their husbands had been seeing her too? My name is Ethan Cole, and I learned the hard way that betrayal is rarely private. It just waits for the right room to become public. I used to believe marriage was a quiet contract between two people who chose each other when they could have chosen anyone else, and I built my life around that belief like it was a load-bearing wall. I worked long hours, paid the bills on time, remembered birthdays without reminders, and I never once asked my wife for proof of where she'd been, because trust, to me, was supposed to be the proof. The kind of man who checks pockets and scrolls screens always looked pathetic in movies, like his insecurity created the crime, and I refused to become that cliché. If you had asked me a month ago whether my wife could ruin our life with a smile, I would have laughed and told you that you were watching too much television. Then, one Thursday afternoon, the universe stopped being subtle about it. It started as an ordinary inconvenience, the kind of small problem that usually dies in your hands before dinner. My car needed a routine service, nothing dramatic, so I took the commuter rail into the city and walked the rest of the way to my office. The day was gray in that forgettable way that makes everyone's clothes look dull, and the air smelled faintly like wet concrete and roasted coffee. I had 3 meetings, a stack of emails, and a promise to be home early because my wife, Lena, had said she wanted to try a new recipe together. That line should have warmed me, but lately her promises felt like decorative throw pillows, placed neatly and never used. She'd been distant without being cruel, distracted without being tired, affectionate in a way that seemed rehearsed. I noticed it, but I didn't accuse her, because accusing someone is a kind of violence, and I was proud of being careful. The first crack appeared at noon, when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. It wasn't a crisis, just an alert from the card I rarely used. A card tied to a small account I kept for household emergencies. The charge was modest, the kind that would never make headlines, but it was oddly specific. A boutique hotel cafe across town, not anywhere near my office or our neighborhood. I stared at the screen for too long, trying to fit it into a reasonable story, and the longer I stared, the more the charge felt like a fingerprint. I told myself it was Lena, that she had met a friend for lunch, that she'd used the wrong card by accident, and that my brain was looking for drama because my week had been dull. Still, I took a screenshot, not because I believed anything, but because something in my gut insisted that the moment mattered. When I got home that evening, Lena was already there, dressed too nicely for cooking, her hair done as if she'd had time to stand in front of the mirror and practice looking relaxed. She kissed me, her mouth warm and quick, and asked about my day with the kind of interest people show when they're filling silence. I asked about hers, and she said she'd been running errands, which is the most flexible sentence in the English language. I nodded and unpacked my bag, and for a few minutes we moved around each other like co-workers sharing a small kitchen. If she noticed my tension, she didn't comment, and if she didn't notice, that was its own kind of insult. Later, while she showered, her phone lit up on the counter with a preview notification. I didn't touch it, I didn't pick it up, I didn't do anything dramatic, but the screen was angled toward me like a confession. The message preview was brief, clipped, and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. It used a nickname Lena had never used for me, and it referenced last time with the casual comfort of repetition. I didn't read the whole thing because the preview cut off, but I saw enough to understand that someone was speaking to my wife as if she belonged to a pattern. I stood there, motionless, with my hands wet from washing a single plate I didn't even need, and I felt my mind do something cold and efficient. It stopped hoping. That night I barely slept, not because I was panicking, but because I was counting. I counted the days she'd been late, the weekends she'd needed space, the sudden interest in new outfits, the way she'd started placing her phone face down, the way she'd laughed at messages while claiming they were from the group chat. The facts lined up with a precision that made me sick. The worst part wasn't the suspicion, it was the clarity. Suspicion still contains mercy because you can be wrong, but clarity leaves no room for comfort. By morning, I had made a decision that surprised me with its calmness. I was not going to beg Lena for honesty, because honesty offered under pressure is never clean. I was not going to smash anything, because broken objects don't fix broken people. I was going to find the edges of the truth, and I was going to make sure the truth had witnesses. The name that kept appearing in my mind wasn't the man's, because I still didn't know it, but the wife's. In affairs, people always talk about the lovers like they're the whole story, but the spouse on the other side is the one who can turn private shame into public consequence. If Lena had been seeing someone married, then that man had a home too, a dinner table too, a woman who believed in routine the same way I used to. I didn't know her yet, but I could already picture her face when reality arrived. It took 2 days to connect the dots, because I refused shortcuts that would make me hate myself later. I didn't hack anything, I didn't install anything, and I didn't stalk like a cartoon villain. I used what life naturally offers to anyone paying attention. I checked our shared calendar and noticed that Lena had started blocking off time with vague labels like committee and planning, which could mean anything or nothing. I compared those blocks to the days the bank notification had appeared, and the overlap was too neat to be accidental. I pulled up the cafe charge again and searched the address, then found the hotel's event listing. There was a charity committee meeting in a private lounge on the day of the charge, and the committee list was public because charities love looking transparent. The list included Lena's name, which made sense, and then a name I recognized because it had been mentioned at a neighborhood event months ago. Derek Hale. Derek Hale, the charming man who volunteered for everything, the guy who shook hands like he was running for office, the one who'd told a story about his wife being the only adult in the house, while everyone laughed like it was cute. Derek Hale, who lived 3 streets over, whose daughter played on the same youth soccer field as my nephew, whose life brushed against mine just enough to feel safe. If Lena had been careless, it would be with someone like that, someone close enough to meet easily and respectable enough to hide behind. I didn't go after Derek first, because men like Derek are trained to deny with confidence. I went after the weak point, the one person Derek couldn't control, the person who would either hate me or understand me instantly. His wife. Her name was Tessa Hale, and the first time I saw her after I learned it, she was standing outside a florist shop with a paper cup of coffee in her hand, scrolling her phone like the world couldn't surprise her anymore. She looked put together in a practical way, not flashy, not trying too hard, but sharp enough that you could tell she noticed details. She wore her wedding ring like it still meant something, which made my throat tighten for reasons I didn't want to admit. I approached her slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the violence of what I was about to drop in her lap. She looked up when my shadow fell across her, and her expression shifted into polite caution. I introduced myself, watched her eyes flicker as she placed me, and then I decided to speak before my own humanity could stop me. I told her that her husband had been seeing my wife. Tessa didn't flinch, which was the first thing that unsettled me. She didn't gasp, she didn't turn pale, she didn't ask me to repeat it, and she didn't slap me like a movie scene. She just narrowed her eyes as if I'd offered her a puzzle piece she'd already been holding in her pocket. Then, slowly, a smile formed on her mouth, controlled and sharp, like someone choosing a weapon they'd been saving. She said with a calmness that felt almost playful that we should grab a drink after my divorce. I stood there, stunned, because I had expected grief or rage, not invitation. For a second, I wondered if I'd misread her, if she was mocking me, if she was the kind of woman who flirted through disasters just to feel powerful. But then I noticed her hand tighten around the coffee cup, the way the paper creased under pressure, and I realized her smile wasn't joy. It was strategy. I let my own mouth tilt into something that looked like a smirk, even though it felt more like a crack in my face. I told her we could do it before. The words landed between us with a strange, electric silence. Tessa's eyes held mine, assessing, calculating, and for the first time since I'd seen Lena's phone light up, I felt something that wasn't pain. I felt control returning, not as a fantasy, but as a possibility. This wasn't romance, not really, and it wasn't revenge in the cheap, reckless sense either. It was leverage. It was alignment. It was two wronged people recognizing that the enemy's strength was the story they were telling everyone else. If we could rewrite that story with facts and timing, then Derek and Lena wouldn't just lose each other. They would lose the clean narrative they were counting on. Tessa took a slow breath, then nodded once, as if she'd just agreed to a business deal. She asked me what I knew, and I told her the truth. Not enough, but enough to start. I mentioned the hotel cafe charge and the committee listing, and I watched her smile fade into something more serious. She said Derek had been busy a lot lately, that he'd blamed stress, that he'd suddenly become protective of his phone, and that he'd started picking fights over small things like grocery brands. She said she'd felt it, but she'd hated herself for imagining it, and hearing it from a stranger made it real in a way she couldn't dismiss. I told her I wasn't there to destroy her life, even if that was exactly what it sounded like. I told her I wanted the truth documented, not whispered, and I wanted consequences that lasted longer than apologies. Tessa nodded again, and this time there was no softness in her face. She asked me when and where, and I realized we were already planning, already moving, already turning pain into something organized. As we stood there outside the florist, the air smelled like crushed stems and cold pavement, and cars passed like the world had no idea what was unfolding. I watched Tessa look down the street toward her car, and I could see the moment she chose a path that didn't include pretending anymore. She looked back at me and said we needed to be careful, because Derek liked to control narratives, and men like that don't panic until they're cornered. I agreed, and I told her the corner was exactly what I intended to build. When I walked away, my hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like something essential had been removed without anesthesia. I got into my car, the one I'd retrieved from the shop, and I sat there for a minute without starting the engine. I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the expression looking back. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't despair. It was the face of a man who had finally accepted that mercy was wasted on people who never offered it. Then my phone buzzed again. Another small alert. Another tiny truth tapping at the glass. And I realized this was no longer just my marriage falling apart. This was a network. And networks collapse when you pull the right thread in front of the right people. By the time I got home, the house felt like a stage after the audience leaves. Quiet, hollow, and still arranged to look believable. Lena's shoes were by the door in that careful way she had, the way someone places objects to prove they belong somewhere, and the air carried a faint citrus cleaner smell that made me think of a crime scene that wanted to be mistaken for a kitchen. She called from the living room that she was on a group call, her voice bright and casual, as if my world hadn't shifted on its axis 2 blocks from a florist shop. I answered with the right tone, the one that says, "I heard you and it's fine." And I walked past the living room without stopping because I was learning a new skill, moving through my own life like a visitor. In the bathroom, I closed the door, stared at my face, and waited for anger to show up like it used to, loud and easy, the kind of emotion men use as a shortcut. It didn't come. What came instead was arithmetic. How many lies did it take to make a marriage look normal? And how many receipts did it take to break the illusion in a way no one could laugh off? I pulled my phone out, opened the screenshot of the cafe charge again, and forced myself to look at the details like an investigator rather than a wounded husband. Date, time, merchant name, amount. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a tidy little mark in the ledger that said my wife had been somewhere she didn't say she was. I created a note file, titled it with a bland name that wouldn't catch attention, and typed the first line, "Hotel cafe charge, 12:07 p.m., Thursday. Then I added one more line. Shared calendar block, committee, 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. 2 facts. No feelings. Feelings were for later. That night I watched Lena like you watch a magician, not because you think you can stop the trick, but because you want to know exactly where the sleight of hand happens. She laughed at her phone more than she laughed at me. She angled the screen away like sunlight could burn it, and she asked me questions that sounded like someone reading a script titled Concerned Spouse. I answered just enough to keep the scene moving. I told myself I wasn't being cowardly. I was being efficient, because confronting her now would only teach her to hide better, and I wasn't interested in a better liar. I was interested in a documented one. In bed, she curled toward me and placed a hand on my chest, a gesture that would have once been intimate, but now felt like a fingerprint left on glass. I lay still, listening to her breathe, and I wondered how long she'd been able to touch me while carrying another man's private life in her pocket. Somewhere in that dark, while she drifted to sleep, I realized the worst part of infidelity isn't the sex. It's the casual entitlement, the belief that you can borrow someone's reality and never pay interest. Lena was sleeping like a person with no debt. The next morning I texted Tessa with a single sentence that sounded neutral, because I didn't trust my own need to over-explain. I wrote that I had a few concrete details, and I wanted to compare notes somewhere public. She replied 10 minutes later with a location and a time and no extra words, which told me everything I needed to know about her personality. This wasn't a woman looking for comfort. This was a woman looking for confirmation. We met at a small coffee place near a commuter rail station, the kind of spot where everyone is in transit and nobody listens because everyone is busy pretending they have a schedule that matters. Tessa arrived on time, ordered without hesitation, and sat down across from me with her phone face down on the table like she'd already decided not to be distracted by excuses. Up close, I could see small signs of strain, the faint darkness under her eyes, the tightness in her jaw when she swallowed, but her posture was firm, upright, controlled. She looked like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had finally found a place to set it down. I slid my phone across the table and showed her the screenshot of the cafe charge. I watched her eyes move over the details with the kind of focus that made my stomach clench, not because I was afraid of her reaction, but because I knew that look. That was the look of someone realizing the thing they suspected was real, and realizing that real things demand action. She didn't ask how I got it, because she already understood it was household level, not spy fantasy. She asked whether Lena ever used that account before, and I told her no, not for that kind of place, not at that time of day, not when she claimed she was running errands. Tessa nodded once, then asked me to say Lena's calendar labels out loud, and I did, and her mouth tightened in a way that suggested Derek had been using similar vague phrases. Tessa pulled her own phone out and opened a photo she'd taken 2 weeks ago, a picture of a charity flyer pinned to their fridge, because apparently we were both living with propaganda now. She zoomed in on a printed list of committee members that included both Derek and Lena. The charity was hosting a gala in 3 weeks, and the committee had access to meetings, vendor coordination, and a private event space. That explained the hotel cafe charge, and it explained how 2 married people could meet without looking suspicious, because nothing screams innocence like, "I'm volunteering." Tessa said she had noticed Derek coming home with tiny details that didn't match, like mentioning a coordinator by the wrong title, or claiming a meeting ran late on a day the committee didn't meet. She said she didn't have proof yet, but she had the pattern, and she was tired of feeling crazy in her own house. I told her I had seen a message preview on Lena's phone that used a nickname and referenced "last time," and Tessa's eyes flicked up sharply, as if she'd just been handed the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been solving alone. She asked whether I had the message screenshot, and I admitted I didn't, because I wasn't touching Lena's phone, and I wasn't handing my conscience to her just to win faster. For a moment, Tessa looked almost impressed. Then she looked annoyed, like integrity was an inconvenient hobby. But she didn't argue. She just said we needed a clean chain of proof that didn't rely on us doing anything stupid. That was the first moment we became a team instead of two people comparing bruises. We built a simple plan, not a conspiracy, because real life collapses under complicated plans. Tessa would watch Derek's calendar and note any committee claims, nothing more than observation. I would do the same with Lena's shared calendar blocks and our shared spending alerts, because money doesn't lie unless you teach it to. We agreed that the goal wasn't to catch them in an act like a tabloid, but to establish a timeline with independent points of confirmation, dates, places, payments. If they were careless enough to turn betrayal into routine, routine would hang them. Before we left, Tessa said something that landed like a cold coin in my palm. She said Derek had been pushing the idea of divorce in small jokes lately, testing how it sounded in the air, as if he wanted to hear the word without consequences. She said he'd also been flattering Lena's strength in front of mutual friends, praising her independence, subtly planting the idea that she deserved more. It wasn't just an affair, it was grooming a narrative. Derek wasn't only sleeping with my wife, he was editing the story so that when the truth surfaced, he could point at the mess and say the marriage was already broken anyway. That was a special kind of arrogance, the kind that makes you want to wipe the smile off a man's face with a court filing. I drove back to my office afterward with a strange calm settling in. The betrayal still hurt, but now it had shape, and shape meant it could be handled. At lunch, I printed the shared calendar week view, the part with Lena's vague committee blocks, and I signed the back with the date, not because I thought a judge would care, but because I wanted a habit of treating facts like evidence, not like gossip. Then I opened my notes file and created a simple ledger. Date, claim, proof, contradiction. It looked boring. It looked powerful. That evening, Lena came home late and announced it like it was weather. She said the committee meeting ran long and her phone died, so she couldn't message. She said it with the confident ease of someone who thinks consistency is optional. I nodded like I believed her, and while she talked, I watched her face for a crack, some brief twitch of uncertainty that would tell me she felt the risk. She didn't. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and walked toward the kitchen, as if she hadn't just insulted my intelligence. After dinner, she went to change, and her purse sat on the chair, open just enough to show a folded paper slip. I didn't dig, I didn't rummage, I didn't become the man I refused to be, but I did glance at what was visible, because she had left it visible. The slip was a valet ticket, white and thin, with a time printed in dark ink. I pulled my phone out, took a quick photo of the ticket as it sat half exposed in the purse, then put my phone away, and walked to the sink to rinse a glass I hadn't used. A valet ticket was nothing by itself, but it was a timestamp, and timestamps are the nails that hold a liar's story to the wall. Later, when Lena was in the shower, I opened our shared calendar and checked the committee meeting time she claimed. Her block said 6:15 to 8:00. The valet ticket time, from the photo I took, was 9:24. Maybe she stayed late. Maybe she went for a drink with friends. Maybe she was innocent. But the point wasn't to decide what it meant tonight. The point was to collect enough nights that her maybe stopped being plausible. I texted Tessa a single line. "I have a valet ticket time from tonight." She replied, "I have Derek claiming the same meeting ran long." No emojis, no sympathy, just confirmation that the lie was coordinated. The following days turned into a grim rhythm. Lena would mention committee tasks, and Derek would mention the same tasks to Tessa. Lena would claim a venue walkthrough, and Derek would claim a vendor meeting. The details never matched perfectly, but the timing always did, like two actors hitting their marks while forgetting the script's smaller lines. I captured small proof points that belonged to my life, without stealing anything that didn't. A merchant alert from my account for a rideshare charge. A photo of a receipt peeking from a jacket pocket, taken beside the day's newspaper like a pathetic little courtroom exhibit. A screenshot of a calendar conflict header when Lena forgot to hide a block before sharing the family schedule. Each piece was tiny, but together they began to form a picture that was impossible to mistake for coincidence. And through all of it, Lena behaved like a person protected by the assumption that I wouldn't fight back, because decent men don't like being loud. She didn't realize decency can also be sharp. The first real shift came when she brought friends over on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced, like she was staging something. I arrived home from a quick grocery run to find 3 women in my living room, perched with drinks, smiling too widely. Lena sat among them like a queen holding court, and for a moment I felt the impulse to turn around and leave, because humiliation is easier to avoid than to endure. Then Lena looked up and said, with rehearsed brightness, that they had decided it was time to divorce me. It wasn't just the words. It was the way her friends smirked, like they were watching a show they'd already paid for. It was the way Lena said we, like my marriage was a committee decision. My hands tightened around the grocery bag handles, and I felt something cold slide into place inside my chest. I asked calmly whether none of them cared that she had been seeing their husbands. The room froze so hard you could have heard the refrigerator hum like a spotlight. One of the women's smiles faltered. Another blinked too fast. Lena's face didn't crumble, not yet, but her eyes sharpened, and I could see the calculation start, the frantic internal search for the next safe lie. I didn't give her time to find it. I set the grocery bags down gently, like a man who was perfectly in control, and I realized this was no longer just about catching them. They had decided to make my humiliation social. Fine. Social worked both ways. And as Lena opened her mouth to respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket with another small alert, another quiet truth tapping at the glass, and I knew exactly which thread I was going to pull next. The buzz in my pocket was a small sound, but in that frozen living room, it felt like a judge's gavel landing on polished wood, and I didn't even check the screen at first because I didn't want them to see me react, since reaction was what this little tribunal had been designed to harvest. Lena sat forward with her knees together and her hands loose on her lap, still playing the part of the reasonable wife who had reached a group decision, while her friends watched me with that brittle confidence people get when they think the crowd makes them untouchable. And for one long second nobody spoke, because nobody knew which script to follow when the target refused to flinch. I took my phone out slowly, not to read it like a man panicking, but to place it face down on the coffee table between us because I wanted them to see that I wasn't looking for a lifeline. I was simply acknowledging that the world continued to deliver facts even while they were busy staging theater. I asked Lena, in a voice that stayed level on purpose, if this was the moment she had planned, the moment where her friends watched her take a victory lap over my humiliation. And I watched her eyes narrow as she tried to decide whether anger or innocence would play better in front of witnesses. One of the women, the one with the sharp bob haircut and the smug little smile that looked practiced, leaned back and crossed her legs like she owned the furniture, and she said Lena didn't need to plan anything because everyone could see our marriage was miserable, and everyone could see Lena deserved better. That was the first lie that mattered, because it wasn't even about the affair. It was about rewriting the past, the desperate attempt to make betrayal look like self-care. I nodded once, like I was hearing a weather report, and I asked her which parts of my marriage she had been monitoring so closely, the finances, the bedroom, the private fights, or just the convenient gossip Lena fed her between drinks. Her face tightened, and Lena cut in quickly, saying this wasn't about her friends. This was about me refusing to accept reality, and she said the word reality with a soft emphasis, as if she could make it true by speaking it calmly. I asked her what reality she meant, the reality where she'd been meeting Derek at the charity committee and calling it volunteer work, or the reality where she'd been borrowing my accounts and my calendar to build a second life while I washed dishes and paid bills. One of the friends made a small scoffing sound, the kind that's meant to dismiss without engaging, And she said I was paranoid and insulting, and she said it the way people say a man is unstable right before they take something from him. I turned my head to look at her, and I asked very simply whether she wanted to call her husband right now and ask him where he was last Thursday at noon, and I watched the color drain from her face in a slow, undeniable wave. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Lena's lips parted just slightly, and in that tiny opening I could see panic trying to slip through, because now this was no longer a story she controlled with friendly witnesses. Now this was a question that could be answered with a phone call. Lena told me to stop making disgusting accusations in front of her friends, and she tried to stand, but I held up one finger, not aggressive, not dramatic, just the universal sign for wait, because I needed the room to understand that I was done being interrupted in my own home. I said I wasn't asking anyone to believe me based on a feeling, because feelings were easy to attack. And I said I was asking them to look at patterns that had dates and times and payments attached to them, and I said if they wanted to keep smirking they could, but they'd be smirking at their own reflections in about 10 minutes. The bob-haired friend swallowed hard, then tried to recover by laughing, and the laugh came out wrong, too high, too thin, like a snapped wire. She said I was trying to scare them because I couldn't handle being left, and she asked Lena if they should go, and Lena nodded too quickly, pushing the moment away with movement, the way a person sweeps glass shards under a rug. They stood, collecting purses and coats, and I watched their hands fumble in small ways, the way hands fumble when the brain is busy recalculating danger. As they moved toward the door, I asked Lena one more question, gentle enough to sound polite and sharp enough to cut, and I asked her whether she told them the truth about who started this, because I suspected she had framed me as the villain in advance, the way people do when they plan to commit a crime of reputation. Lena stepped close, keeping her voice low, and she said I was embarrassing her, and she said I was ruining everything, and she said it with the kind of outrage that only appears when consequences show up uninvited. I asked her what exactly I was ruining, her marriage or her schedule, and she stared at me with a hatred that wasn't hot, but cold, like a freezer door opening. Then she turned and walked her friends out, and I listened as the front door clicked shut behind them, leaving my living room suddenly empty of witnesses and full of the aftermath. For a minute, Lena stood with her back to me, hands on the edge of the entry table, breathing in short pulls, and I almost expected her to cry, because that's the move people use when they need sympathy to reset the board. She didn't cry. She turned around and said I was sick, and she said I was accusing her friends' husbands just to hurt her, and she said I was proving why she needed a divorce. I asked her why she had brought them here instead of talking to me privately, and she said she needed support because I was impossible, and I asked her what support looked like, 3 smirking spectators in my living room while she announced my replacement like a casting decision. That's when I picked up my phone again and finally checked the alert that had buzzed during the showdown, and what I saw made my mouth go dry, even though it was exactly what I'd expected in the back of my mind. It was a merchant notification from an account in my name, a small charge at a boutique hotel bar on the other side of town, and the timestamp was 43 minutes ago, which meant Lena had been there before she staged this performance, warming up with Derek or someone like him, while I bought groceries and walked into an ambush. I didn't show her the screen. I just looked at her and asked where she'd been before I came home. Lena didn't hesitate, which was its own answer, because rehearsed lies arrive faster than honest memory. She said she'd been at a committee check-in, then she said she'd stopped at the pharmacy, then she said she'd picked up a few things for the house, stacking errands like sandbags. I nodded as if I accepted it, and I asked which pharmacy, and she named one that was nowhere near the hotel bar, and she did it with the confidence of someone who thought I had no way to fact-check. I told her I had to take a call for work, and I went into the kitchen, not because I needed privacy from her, but because I needed privacy from the part of myself that wanted to erupt, since eruption would hand her the narrative she was clearly trying to write. I texted Tessa a screenshot of the merchant alert with a short line that said, "Hotel bar charge today," right before she staged a divorce scene. Tessa replied within 2 minutes, and her message was a clean blade. She said Derek had just texted her that he'd be late because the committee had an emergency vendor problem, and she included a screenshot of his message, and the timestamp matched my alert closely enough to make my skin prickle. 2 spouses, 1 excuse, same window. If nothing else, it proved coordination, and coordination proved intent. I put the phone away, took a slow breath, and walked back into the living room with the calm face I'd been practicing, because calm was the only weapon that didn't leave bruises for them to point at later. I told Lena that if she wanted a divorce, she could file properly, and I told her I wouldn't beg her to stay, because I wasn't interested in staying with someone who needed an audience to leave. I watched her blink, thrown off by my lack of pleading, and she tried to pivot by saying she was afraid of me, not physically, she implied, but emotionally, the way a person implies danger without naming it. I asked her to be specific, because specifics are the enemy of manipulation, and she couldn't, so she grabbed her phone and stormed toward the bedroom, saying she didn't have to justify herself to me anymore. When she was gone, I sat on the couch and stared at the indentation her friends had left in the cushions, 3 little dents like evidence of trespass, and I realized something that made the situation both worse and clearer. Lena hadn't brought them here to announce a divorce. She'd brought them here to record my reaction in their memories, to create a chorus of witnesses who would later say I was unstable, jealous, paranoid, cruel, whatever label served her. The divorce announcement wasn't the point. The performance was. That meant my plan needed to widen, because evidence wasn't only about catching an affair, it was about defending reality from being rewritten. I opened my notes file and added 2 new columns to my ledger, one for narrative moves and one for witness tampering by social pressure, and I wrote down the exact phrases Lena used, the way she said, "We decided," the way her friend called me miserable, the way Lena implied fear without details. It felt ridiculous, like I was documenting a bad play, but I understood that bad plays become court stories when people repeat them often enough. I wasn't going to let repetition become truth. That evening, Lena came out of the bedroom wearing makeup she didn't need for a quiet night, and she said she was going out to clear her head, and she said it with the same tone she used when she lied about committee meetings, which meant she hadn't even bothered to change her tools. I asked where she was going, and she said she didn't owe me that. And I told her she was right, she didn't. And I watched her pause again, because she had been ready for control, not permission. She left with her purse and her phone and her carefully arranged outrage, and the house became quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like the pause before something breaks. I didn't follow her. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. Instead, I took out the folder I had started, the one where I printed and labeled the small pieces of proof I could gather without trespassing into anything illegal or stupid. And I added today's merchant alert, printed and signed on the back, and I added Tessa's screenshot of Derek's matching excuse, and I wrote one line beneath them. Coordinated cover story, committee emergency, used simultaneously. Then, because I needed something actionable, I called Tessa, and when she answered, her voice sounded steady, but tired, like someone who had been carrying shock for weeks. I told her about the staged divorce scene, the friends, the smirks, the attempt to paint me as unstable, and I heard her exhale in a way that said Derek had been setting up something similar. She said Derek had been dropping hints to mutual friends that she was clingy, that she was spiraling, and she said it made sense now, because if men like Derek can't control the facts, they try to control the audience. We agreed on a next step that was simple, lawful, and brutal in its clarity. We would stop trying to argue with our spouses and start building a single shared timeline that could be shown to neutral eyes without drama. We picked 3 anchors we could realistically obtain within days: a clean shared calendar week view showing the committee blocks, a receipt trail showing the hotel bar and cafe charges tied to our accounts, and one neutral witness line from someone who could place Derek and Lena together in a public, ordinary moment, like a bartender or a clerk, without any theatrics. We weren't hunting a confession. We were hunting a pattern. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room and listened to the clock tick, and I realized my marriage had turned into a courtroom where the verdict was being written by whoever talked first and loudest. Lena had tried to bring a jury into my home to watch me lose. Fine. If she wanted a jury, I would give her one later, but I would give them documents, not speeches. Near midnight, Lena came back, and I heard her keys in the lock and her shoes kicked off with a careless thud, and she walked into the living room with a faint smell of hotel perfume clinging to her coat, the kind that doesn't come from pharmacies or grocery stores. She stopped when she saw me sitting there, awake, calm, and waiting. She asked why I was staring at her like that, and I told her I wasn't staring, I was listening, because I wanted to hear what story she was going to tell this time. Lena's face tightened, and she said she was done. She was truly done, and she said tomorrow she would call a lawyer, and she said it like a threat meant to scare me into apologizing. I nodded again, that same quiet nod that made her nervous, and I told her she should call whoever she wanted, because I wasn't afraid of paperwork, and I wasn't afraid of truth, and she hesitated for a half-second, as if my confidence didn't match the version of me she had been selling. Then she walked past me toward the bedroom, and as she did, her phone lit up in her hand with a message preview that she didn't realize I could see, a single line that flashed like a blade in the dark. I caught only 3 words before she tilted the screen away, but the words were enough to make my pulse slow down into something colder. It said, "Did it work?" I did not ask her who sent it, because questions like that are invitations for lies, and I was past the stage of taking invitations from a woman who needed an audience to do harm. I let the glow from her phone die against her palm, and I watched her face for the smallest twitch that would confirm what my gut already knew, which was that tonight had been a test run, a rehearsal meant to measure how easily she could push me into a public role. The unstable husband, the jealous man, the one who ranted while the calm wife sought safety in friends. Lena stiffened, as if she felt the weight of my silence, and she tried to fill it by saying I was exhausting and obsessive, and she tried to throw the accusation like a blanket over the whole mess, as if naming me a problem could erase the evidence forming in my hands. I told her, without raising my voice, that I saw the message preview, and I told her I was not going to chase her down a hallway for answers she would weaponize later, and I told her that if she wanted to end our marriage, she could do it through proper channels instead of group performances. She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, then she stopped, because arguing required facts, and facts were the one thing she was suddenly nervous about. She walked into the bedroom and shut the door with controlled force, not a slam, not anything dramatic that could be described as fear later, just enough sound to communicate contempt. And I stayed on the couch because I refused to chase her into a private space where she could claim anything she wanted. Instead, I picked up my phone and typed 3 words into my notes file. Did it work? Then I wrote the time, and I wrote message preview scene, and I wrote possible coordination, because evidence is not only screenshots and receipts, it is also the clean record of what happened while the other side tries to keep everything foggy. I slept badly, which is to say, I slept in fragments, waking at every soft sound, like the house had become a crime scene that might rearrange itself when I wasn't looking. At 6 in the morning, I got up and moved through my routine with the kind of calm that feels almost cruel, because I knew Lena expected a hangover of conflict, a morning filled with accusations and pleading and emotional mess, and I wanted her to feel the opposite, the quiet friction of a man who had started choosing strategy over pain. She came out around 7, hair brushed, face already composed, and she looked at me like she was checking whether the trap had produced the desired injury. She asked if I was going to apologize for last night, and she asked it too smoothly, as if she had practiced the line in the mirror. I told her I had nothing to apologize for, because I didn't invite her friends into our living room to mock anyone, and I told her that if she wanted to continue the divorce talk, we could do it without spectators and without rewriting history. She scoffed and said she would be talking to a lawyer, and I said she should, because lawyers prefer clean timelines, and she paused again at the word timeline like it was a code she suddenly didn't like. After she left for work, or for whatever she called work now, I did the first thing I should have done weeks ago, which was stop hoping that respect would restrain her. I opened our shared calendar on my own device, the one we both used for bills and appointments, and I scrolled the last 2 weeks, taking screenshots of the committee blocks she had been using as cover, not because a block proves an affair, but because the blocks created a pattern, and patterns are what collapse false narratives. I exported the week view as a PDF, because a PDF looks like paperwork, and paperwork has a way of changing the temperature in rooms where people have been cozy with lies. Then I opened the banking app for the account in my name, the one she had access to for household spending, and I pulled up the hotel bar charge again, and I found 2 more small charges nearby that I had not noticed in the heat of last night. A rideshare charge to a pickup location that was nowhere near our neighborhood, and a cafe charge 2 blocks from the hotel, both within a tight window that didn't match her committee check-in story. I screenshot the entries, then I printed them on the home printer, because screenshots live and die inside devices, but paper becomes an object you can hold while somebody tries to talk over you. I was sliding the printouts into a clear sleeve when my phone buzzed with a text from Tessa, and she wrote that Derek had changed his story again, that now he claimed the committee emergency had turned into a vendor dispute, and that he was using the same 2 phrases each time, like he was reading from a script. I asked her to send me the exact text, and when she did, I saw it immediately. The repetition, the unnatural consistency, the way people lie when they're coordinated. Because original lies have texture and messy details, but scripted lies arrive polished and identical. I told Tessa we needed one public anchor, one moment where Derek and Lena could be placed together by something neutral. Not a friend, not a rumor, not a private message, but a simple reality check from the outside world. Tessa suggested the boutique hotel bar because Derek had mentioned meeting a donor there once, and she said the bartender there remembered faces because the place was small and the regulars liked to feel recognized. I told her I would not ask anyone for anything illegal, and I would not pressure anyone into drama, but I could buy a coffee in a public place and ask a simple question that didn't require anyone to take sides. By late morning, I was in my car, driving to the hotel district with my dash cam running like it always did, not because I was trying to build some cinematic evidence moment, but because routine documentation is the only kind that doesn't look like stalking. I parked in a public garage, took the ticket, and put it in my wallet, because everything in my life had turned into a timestamp. When I walked into the lobby, the air smelled like citrus cleaner and expensive boredom, and I felt a flicker of something close to shame, because this was not the kind of man I thought I would become. The man who hunted the truth in polite places while his marriage died quietly at home. The bar sat off to the side, dim even in daylight, and I chose a stool where I could see the entrance without looking like I was scanning for prey. I ordered coffee, because it made me look like a normal person with a normal purpose, and while the bartender worked the machine, I watched him, middle-aged, calm, professional, the type who could hear 100 secrets a week without caring. When he set the cup down, I asked him a question that felt casual but carried a sharp edge under the words, and I asked whether he remembered a couple from yesterday, a blonde woman who looked angry and controlled, and a man in a dark jacket who kept checking his phone like he was waiting for someone to text. Did it work? The bartender raised his eyebrows slightly, and that small movement told me I had hit something real. He said he couldn't discuss guests, and his voice was careful, the kind of careful that comes from policy and self-preservation. I nodded and said I understood, and I did not argue, because arguments create resistance, and resistance creates stories that can be twisted later. I slid my receipt from the coffee toward myself and said I wasn't asking him to give me names. I was asking him one question that could be answered without harming anyone: whether the person who paid the bar tab yesterday used a card that had my first name on it. He looked at me, then at the receipt printer, then back at me. And he didn't answer directly, but he said the line he probably used when a spouse came in before, the line that let him protect himself while still letting reality leak through. He said, very quietly, that sometimes people pay with cards that are not theirs, and he said it like a warning disguised as a neutral statement. Then he added, even more quietly, that the woman I described had been there, and that she had left with the man in the dark jacket, and that they did not look like colleagues. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because I needed the confirmation, but because confirmation makes everything irreversible. I thanked him, left a tip that was generous enough to signal appreciation but not desperate enough to look like bribery, and I walked out with my coffee still half full because suddenly the taste didn't matter. Outside in the lobby, I stopped near a brochure stand and took a photo of the parking ticket beside my coffee cup because it anchored me to this time and place, and I took a photo of the receipt with the date visible because proof is built from small, boring pieces stacked until nobody can kick them over. In the car, I called Tessa and told her what the bartender had said, and she went silent for a moment that felt like a wave pulling back before it hits. She said she believed me, and she said she didn't need more pain, she needed direction, and I told her the direction was simple. We would stop reacting and start controlling the record. She asked what that meant, and I told her it meant we would pick a public arena where lies had to wear name tags, where policies mattered, where minutes could be taken, where there would be a facilitator whose job was to keep things civil, because civil rooms are the best places to destroy people who depend on chaos. Tessa said Derek's company was hosting a community fundraiser dinner in 10 days, a polished event with donors and photos and speeches, and she said Lena had been pushing hard to attend as part of the committee, making it sound like an honor. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in, not because I wanted revenge in a dramatic sense, but because I understood the geometry of it. A fundraiser dinner meant a guest list. It meant seating charts. It meant staff. It meant a program. It meant receipts. It meant public optics. And it meant a room full of people who cared deeply about looking ethical. I told Tessa we would not create a scene, and we would not throw accusations like grenades, and we would not do anything that could be spun as harassment. We would bring a one-page timeline, clean and factual, and we would choose one humiliation style that was quiet but undeniable. Something like evidence packets placed before anyone sat, or a neutral slideshow of dates and payments. And we would let the room do what rooms like that always do when confronted with verified embarrassment. It would turn cold. It would take a step back. It would isolate the people who brought rot into a polished space. When I got home, Lena was not there, and the emptiness felt temporary, like the calm in a house where something has been removed but not yet replaced. I opened my evidence folder on the dining table and arranged the pieces in order, not because I enjoyed it, but because order is the only antidote to gaslighting. I had the shared calendar PDF, the bank entries, the hotel receipt, the parking ticket photo, Tessa's screenshot of Derek's script-like excuse, and a short typed note of the bartender's non-direct confirmation, carefully worded, with no claims of bribes or dramatic statements, just staff-recognized described pair, left together, did not appear professional, and even writing that felt risky, because in a divorce-adjacent war, everything becomes a weapon. At 4 p.m, Lena texted me asking if we could talk like adults tonight, and I stared at the message for a long time, because that phrase was always used by people who had already decided what the adult outcome should be. I replied that we could talk, but not in front of her friends, and not with vague threats, and not with rehearsed scripts, and she replied with a thumbs-up emoji like this was a casual scheduling change instead of the collapse of our marriage. That night, She came home with a plastic bag of takeout like she was trying to restore normalcy through fried food, and she set it on the counter and said we needed to agree on a clean separation. No drama, no accusations. And she said it while refusing to look at my eyes. I told her I agreed about one thing. There would be no drama. Then I placed the clear sleeve on the table and slid it toward her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the calm precision of a man laying down a document in a room that suddenly becomes official. Lena's eyes dropped to the paper, and for a second, her face went blank. The way faces go blank when the mind is rushing through consequences faster than the body can react. She tried to laugh, but the laugh was too thin, and she said I was being ridiculous, and she said I was stalking her, and she said it quickly, because she needed the word stalking to appear before the evidence could settle. I told her I had not stalked anyone, and I told her everything I had was from my accounts, my calendar, public places, and basic memory, and I told her that if she wanted to claim I was unstable, she would need more than a word, she would need proof. She snapped that she didn't care about my proof because she was done, and she stood up like she was going to walk away again, and I said one sentence that stopped her in place, not because it was loud, but because it was specific. I told her I knew last night was a test, and I told her I knew someone texted, "Did it work?" And I told her that if she wanted to keep playing games, I could start asking questions in rooms where policies and minutes existed. Lena turned slowly, and her eyes were sharp now, not scared, but calculating, and she asked me what I thought I was doing. I told her I was building a record, and I told her she should be careful, because records do not care who smirks first, and her lips parted like she was about to threaten me again. But instead, she said something else, something that sounded almost like a confession wrapped in contempt. She said I didn't understand what I had stepped into, and she said Derek was protected, and she said I was going to embarrass myself if I tried to fight people with real power. I stared at her for a long moment, and I realized that Derek was not just an affair partner to her, he was leverage, a connection to something she valued more than the marriage she was cutting apart. I nodded slowly, and I told her she was right about one thing. I didn't understand the whole shape of it yet, and her eyes flickered again at the word yet, because it implied I was still moving. Then her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it, and she made a small mistake, a tiny one, the kind people make when they are tired of pretending. She smiled before she picked it up, a private smile meant for someone else, and in that instant I knew tonight's talk was never meant to be resolution. It was meant to be containment. And as she lifted the phone, her voice softened into a tone she hadn't used with me in months, and she stepped away toward the hallway like she was escaping a bad smell, and I listened as she answered in a whisper I couldn't quite hear, and I understood that whatever Derek was protected by, Lena had already chosen it over me. So, I did not follow her. I opened my notes file, added a new line, and wrote the next move I had been trying not to admit to myself, because it meant the war was going public whether I liked it or not. Fundraiser dinner in 10 days. Evidence must be ready before then. And in the quiet after her whispered call, I realized the worst part was not the betrayal itself, but the way she had tried to turn me into the villain of her story, because if she could do that successfully, she would not just leave me, she would erase me. But the next message that buzzed on my phone told me she had misjudged one thing, because it was from a number I didn't recognize, and it contained only a single sentence that made my blood go cold in a completely new way. It said, "Stop asking questions, or we make you the story." My first instinct was to delete the message, because my mind tried to treat it like spam, like a cheap scare line that would dissolve if I refused to look at it. But the cold part of me, the part that had been learning to live without illusions, recognized the real purpose of a threat like that, which was not to warn me, but to shape my behavior through uncertainty, to make me hesitate before I put anything into a room with witnesses and policies and minutes. I did not reply, because replies create a conversation, and conversations create hooks for someone else to pull on later. So I took a screenshot, Then I took a second screenshot that included the time and the number, then I saved both into a folder labeled with the date, because if someone wanted to make me the story, then the first step was to prove that they had tried. I opened my notes file and wrote a clean line, the kind that would look calm on paper even if my hands were not calm in my chest, and I wrote that an unknown number threatened reputational retaliation after I raised proof concerns. And I wrote that the threat arrived minutes after Lena stepped away to take a whispered call, because timelines matter when people try to rewrite cause and effect. I waited until Lena returned to the kitchen, and I watched her face the way you watch a person holding a concealed blade, not to be dramatic, but to notice the tells, and when she walked back in, she was composed again, almost too composed, with that same soft, careful expression that never reached her eyes. She asked if I was done playing detective, and she said it like it was a joke, like I was a bored man inventing a hobby, and I told her I received a threatening message after her call, and I told her I had documented it. She paused, just a fraction, and the pause was a confession in the language of people who want plausible deniability, because an innocent person would ask what it said, and a guilty person tries not to learn details they might later claim not to know. She said, with a kind of practiced disbelief, that I was paranoid, and she said if I kept spiraling, she would tell people I was unstable, and I almost laughed at the irony, because that was exactly what the message promised, only now it was coming from her mouth with a domestic smile. I told her, still calm, that she could tell people whatever story she wanted, but the minute she involved third parties to damage me, I would treat it as deliberate harm, not marital conflict, and I would respond in ways that did not require emotion, only documentation. She tried to turn the conversation into accusations about my control, my coldness, my lack of affection, and I let her talk, because a person under pressure reveals what they fear by what they reach for first. And she kept returning to the same theme, which was that I would look crazy if I kept asking questions. When she went back to the bedroom, I did not follow her, and I did not sleep much either, because the threat turned the house into a space where every sound felt like someone else moving pieces around me. At 3 a.m, I sat at the dining table and built a simple evidence ledger on paper, not because paper was romantic, but because paper does not glitch, paper does not require passwords, paper does not vanish when an account is locked, and I needed something that could survive if someone tried to corner me with a narrative. I wrote each item with date, source, and what it proved, and I kept the language clinical, because clinical language is harder to mock in public, and I added the new threat screenshot as its own entry, because intimidation is evidence too when you are dealing with people who rely on silence. In the morning, I called Tessa and asked her to meet me somewhere neutral, and we chose a cafe that was busy enough to discourage theatrics, and I arrived early, ordered a coffee, and picked a table where no one could easily stand behind me and glance at my phone. When Tessa walked in, I noticed she looked like she hadn't slept either, with that brittle focus of someone who is trying to function while their life rearranges itself underneath them. She sat down and asked what happened, and when I showed her the threat message, her face tightened, but she did not look surprised, which was its own kind of information. She told me Derek had been acting managed, which was her word, and she said he had suddenly started using phrases like brand risk and reputation spiral, and she said those were not Derek's words, because Derek usually talked like a man who thought he could charm his way through consequences. She told me Derek's workplace was obsessed with image, obsessed with donors and community standing, and she told me the fundraiser dinner was not just a dinner, it was an optics engine, the kind of event where a rumor could kill a promotion, and the kind of event where someone with power could decide who was welcome and who was quietly erased. That was when the shape of the threat shifted in my mind, because the message did not sound like a jealous lover, and it did not sound like a panicked husband, and it did not sound like one of Lena's friends who enjoyed cruelty as a hobby. It sounded like someone who thought in terms of narratives and containment, someone whose job involved controlling what people believed, and that meant my real enemy might not be Derek at all, because Derek was messy, and messy people do not write sleek intimidation lines. I told Tessa that if we were going to do this, we had to do it in a way that made it hard for anyone to paint us as unstable or vindictive, which meant no screaming confrontations, no vague accusations, no social media rants, and no back-channel gossip we could not prove. Tessa nodded and said she wanted that too, but she also wanted to hurt Derek, and I understood that urge, because hurt feels like control when you have been made helpless. But control is not the same as victory, and I needed her to keep her footing. I told her we would build a dossier that could stand up in a room where people pretended to be ethical, and we would use only lawful evidence, and we would deliver it in a way that forced a record. She asked what I meant by a record, and I told her I meant a facilitator, a secretary, an HR representative, an event coordinator, someone whose role was to document and confirm, because truth without a witness is just a private pain, and private pain is easy for liars to bury. After the cafe, I drove to a small office park across town because I had decided I needed legal advice before Lena's narrative became the only narrative, and I found a family law attorney through a simple search. Nothing secret, nothing underhanded, just a professional whose job was to translate chaos into filings and deadlines. The waiting room smelled like copier toner and stale mints, and the silence there felt heavy, because everyone sat with that same stunned posture, like they had all stepped into the same bad chapter of life. When I met the attorney, a woman named Marin, I did not tell her a dramatic story, and I did not ask for revenge, because revenge is what people call it when they don't understand strategy. I told her I was being pushed into a public divorce confrontation, and I told her I had evidence of infidelity and coordinated intimidation, and I told her I wanted to protect myself from false allegations while preparing for a clean separation. Marin asked what kind of intimidation, and I showed her the screenshot, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she asked whether Lena had ever threatened to claim abuse or instability, and I said yes, not directly with those words, but by repeating that I would look crazy. Marin nodded like she had seen that play before, and she told me, very plainly, that if someone wants to paint you as unstable, you respond with stability that can be proven, which meant documenting communication, avoiding private confrontations, avoiding angry texts, and keeping interactions in spaces where conduct could be confirmed by neutral people if needed. She did not promise me some instant justice because real lawyers do not sell magic, but she gave me a simple plan that felt like a railing in a stairwell, and she told me to start using a dedicated email thread for logistics, to keep language short and neutral, to stop discussing emotional topics in person, and to consider filing first, not as an act of aggression, but as an act of containment, because the first filer often sets the tone and the timeline. She also told me to save every threat and every hint of coordination, because intimidation can become relevant when custody, property, or restraining claims enter the picture, even if nobody is being arrested, and she emphasized that my goal was not to punish Lena with the system, but to prevent Lena from punishing me with a story. When I left Marin's office, I felt a grim clarity settle in, because the threat message had done one thing I did not expect, which was to remove my last trace of hope that Lena would resolve this privately. If she had been willing to involve outside pressure, then she was already committed to turning my reputation into a bargaining chip, and I needed to act as if I was negotiating with someone who would happily burn the house to win the argument. That evening when I got home, Lena was in the living room with her laptop open, and she looked up with a brittle smile and said she had talked to someone about our situation, and she said it in the way people say they have arranged insurance, like it was a procedural necessity. I asked who, and she said it was none of my business, and she added that I should be careful about embarrassing her, because she had friends who could make problems go away, and she said it with a softness that made it worse, because soft threats are meant to sound reasonable. I did not react, because reaction was what she wanted, but I noticed something on her screen as she shifted the laptop, a calendar invite header with the fundraiser logo, and beneath it, a list of preferred seating, and I saw Derek's name in that list before she snapped the lid down. She thought she had hidden it fast enough, but eyes like mine only needed a fraction, and in that fraction I learned the fundraiser was not just an event. It was a stage she had already rehearsed on, a place she expected to control, who sat where, who spoke to whom, who looked legitimate, and who looked like an intruder. I went to the kitchen, opened my evidence folder, and added one new line to the ledger in clean ink. Fundraiser seating coordination observed, includes Derek, indicates planned optics. I did not tell Lena I wrote it, because telling her would teach her what to hide next, and I had reached the phase where I stopped educating my opponent. Later, in the quiet after she went to bed, my phone buzzed again, and for a second I expected another threat, but instead it was a message from an unknown contact request, a profile with no photo, and the text was short, cautious, and almost polite. It said, "If you go public at the fundraiser, you will be framed, and I can prove they planned it." I stared at the screen until my eyes started to ache, because suddenly the game had a new piece on the board, and I could not tell if it was an ally offering a lifeline or a trap designed to pull me into private communication that could be edited and weaponized. Then the next message arrived before I could decide, and it made my stomach drop in a way that felt strangely familiar because it sounded like the same voice behind the first threat, only now it was wearing a different mask. It said, "Meet me tomorrow, or they file first, and you lose the story." I did not sleep after that last message, because the phrase "you lose the story" landed like a hand on my throat, and it told me exactly how the enemy thought, which was not like a lover in panic, but like a manager of outcomes who believed reputation was a lever you could pull until a person snapped. I sat at the table with my phone face down, because staring at it felt like staring into a well, and I wrote 2 columns on paper, one labeled risk and one labeled benefit, because paper forces you to be honest when your brain wants to improvise. Under risk, I wrote trap, edited screenshots, staged confrontation, false witness, and under benefit, I wrote proof, insider context, timeline confirmation, and I left the list there so I could see that neither side was light. By sunrise, I had decided that if I met the anonymous contact, I would do it the way Marin would approve, which meant daylight, public place, and no private car rides, because nothing ruins a man faster than being alone with someone who wants to invent a narrative. I sent one sentence back, carefully plain, asking for a location in public, and I added that I would not meet anywhere isolated, and I would not discuss anything over voice calls. The reply arrived within a minute, and that speed told me the person was waiting for me to flinch, and it gave me a time and a place that sounded safe on paper, a coffee roaster tour event downtown, the kind with families and camera-happy staff, where the background noise would make eavesdropping difficult and dramatics look ridiculous. I arrived early again, because early is control, and control is the only clean drug left when your home becomes an unstable stage. The space smelled like hot beans and sugar, and the line moved slowly, which was perfect, because slow lines create natural witnesses who see faces and remember posture. I picked a spot near the front where I could see both entrances, and I did the calm breathing trick I learned years ago during a job that rewarded stillness, not bravado, even though I never told Lena that my mind was trained to watch for patterns the way other men watched sports. A woman approached from the side rather than the door, which meant she had been inside watching, and she looked ordinary on purpose, mid-30s, clean coat, hair pinned back, eyes too alert for someone who was just there for coffee. She did not say my name, because names create a recording, and instead she asked if I knew whether the tour included samples, like we were strangers making small talk, and when I nodded, she said, softly, that we had 5 minutes before the next group moved, and that she would keep it short. She introduced herself as Paige, and she did it without warmth, like she was handing me an ID across a counter. She said she worked part-time as a volunteer coordinator for the fundraiser committee, And she said she did not care about my marriage, but she cared about what was being planned for the event because it crossed a line that made her feel complicit. She told me that Lena had been meeting with Derek's circle under the cover of donor seating, and she told me there was a document floating around, not a secret database, just a shared agenda printout, listing how the evening would handle unexpected disruptions. And she said my name was in that document as a risk factor, framed as a man who might cause a scene. I kept my face neutral, because outrage turns into a performance, and performance is what they wanted from me. But inside my stomach tightened with a strange relief, because Paige's words matched the shape of the threat message, the same obsession with optics, the same idea that I was a problem to be managed. I asked Paige why she was telling me, and she said she had seen this kind of planning before, the way committees quietly decide who is a villain, and she said she hated how easily people chose cruelty when it was wrapped in protecting the mission. Then she gave me the key detail that made the hairs on my arms lift, because she said the plan was not just to paint me as unstable, but to bait me into looking aggressive in front of witnesses who mattered. She said they expected me to show up and confront Lena publicly, and she said if that happened, security would be instructed to document my behavior and remove me, not violently, just firmly in front of the room, so the story would become husband melts down at charity dinner. She said the narrative would spread before I could say a full sentence, because people prefer the first version of a story, even when the first version is a lie. I asked Paige what proof she had, and she did not pull out a phone like a movie, because real people do not hand you a perfect screenshot on a silver tray, but she did tell me something better, which was where proof existed in an everyday, lawful form. She said the committee used printed agendas with headers, because the chair liked paper, and she said there would be a prep meeting later that afternoon at the venue, a church fundraiser dinner planning session with a board secretary taking minutes. She said if I wanted proof, I should not storm in, but I should position myself to receive what would naturally exist after that meeting, which was a public agenda, a volunteer memo, or an email header confirming changes. Before she walked away, she added one more line, and she delivered it like she was swallowing something bitter, because she said Derek's wife was not being kept in the dark the way I assumed, and she said Tessa was not the only spouse being handled. She said Derek's wife had been approached already, and not with apologies, but with persuasion, as if she could be recruited into accepting a clean divorce narrative for the good of everyone's image. Paige did not say whether Derek's wife agreed, but she said the approach happened, and that meant the enemy did not fear Tessa's anger, because they believed they could manage it too. When Paige disappeared into the crowd, I stood there with my coffee untouched, listening to the tour guide describe roasting temperatures like any of it mattered. And I realized that the threat was not just aimed at me, it was aimed at the entire network around me. They wanted every spouse angry in private and polite in public, because that is how you keep affairs alive in plain sight, by turning betrayal into a paperwork problem instead of a moral one. I drove home without music, because music would have made my thoughts feel cinematic, and I did not want cinematic. I wanted precise. In the driveway, I sat for a minute and wrote a new ledger entry on paper, summarizing Paige's claims without embellishment, because you cannot put "she seemed sincere" into a courtroom or a mediation room and expect it to hold. I noted the existence of a disruption plan, the expected bait and remove tactic, the prep meeting, and the board secretary minutes, and then I made myself do the hardest part, which was to plan how to get proof without behaving like a man who was trying to get proof. Inside the house, Lena was already in motion, dressed as if she had somewhere important to be, and she was on her phone with that controlled brightness that made her sound generous even when she was being cruel. She ended the call when she saw me, and she asked where I had been, and I told her I had been meeting with an attorney again, because I wanted to test whether truth made her nervous. Her eyes sharpened for a moment, then softened again, and she said she hoped I was not going to make things ugly, because she wanted things civil, and the word civil sounded like a knife wrapped in cotton. I asked casually whether she was going to the fundraiser prep meeting today, and I watched her mouth tighten before she smiled, and she said yes, because she had responsibilities, because she was on the committee, because she cared about community, and she stacked those words like bricks. I nodded and asked what time, as if I was simply coordinating dinner plans, and she gave me a time that matched what Paige implied, and she added that it would be long, which was her lazy way of building cover into the day. When she left, she kissed my cheek with a kind of performance tenderness that made me feel like an object. And as the door closed, I did not chase her, and I did not text her, and I did not do anything that would create a trace of me trying to control her movements. Instead, I opened the shared family calendar on my own device, the one we had always used for normal life, and I exported the week view as a PDF, because normal tools create normal records, and I saved it with a date label. Then I opened my email and searched for anything from the fundraiser committee in the shared inbox we used for household bills, because Lena had been sloppy before, and people who feel powerful stay sloppy until the moment they lose. There it was, buried in the clutter, an email header from the venue coordinator with a subject line about seating and risk management. And even without opening it, I could see the timestamp and the sender, and my heart beat harder, because this was not rumor. This was the kind of boring proof that ruins exciting lies. I saved the email with headers visible, then I printed it, then I signed the back with the date, because I wanted a chain of custody that would look sane if anyone ever questioned it. Still, I needed more than one piece, because one piece is a story, and two pieces start to look like a pattern. I called Tessa and asked if she could meet me later, and I did not tell her about Paige over the phone, because phones are where misunderstandings grow teeth. We agreed to meet at a public library cafe, and when I arrived, I brought a folder, not a dramatic binder, just a thin, clear sleeve with dated items, because I wanted Tessa to see that I was not building a revenge fantasy, I was building a record. Tessa came in tense, but when I showed her the email header, her shoulders dropped in a way that looked like exhaustion more than relief. She told me Derek had been acting strangely confident again, like a man who believed the outcome was already decided, and she said he kept repeating that she was overreacting, and that phrase landed in my head like a stamp, because it sounded coached, the way everyone in these circles borrowed language to flatten other people's pain. I told Tessa, carefully, that someone from the committee had warned me they planned to bait me at the fundraiser, and I watched Tessa's expression shift from anger to focus, because anger is easy, but focus is rare in the middle of heartbreak. She asked what we were going to do, and I told her we were going to let them build their stage, and then we were going to replace their story with a simpler one, a one-page timeline, dates, places, payments, and confirmations, and we were going to deliver it in a way that forced documentation, not debate. Tessa asked if that meant we were going to confront them at the fundraiser, and I said yes, but not like they expected, because they wanted shouting, and we would give them silence. They wanted emotion, and we would give them paper. They wanted a man dragged out by security, and we would give them a committee forced to acknowledge evidence on record. As I said it, I realized something else, something that turned the day colder. Because if Paige was right, then Lena was not just cheating, she was coordinating with someone who had power over the room, and that meant my enemy was not the affair, it was the apparatus around it, the people who treated betrayal as an image problem to be solved. That was bigger than Derek, and it was bigger than Lena's smugness, and it meant the next steps would not be about catching them, because they were already caught in their own arrogance, but about choosing the moment when the record would snap shut on their hands. On my way out of the library cafe, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was not anonymous. It was Lena, and the message was short, almost sweet, and that was how I knew it was poison, because she wrote that the fundraiser was a fresh start for both of us, and she hoped I would behave if I came, because people were watching. I stared at that last phrase until the words blurred, because now I knew who had written the threat message in spirit, even if not in fact, and I understood the real bet they were making. They thought watching would make me quiet, and they thought quiet would make them safe, and they had no idea that watching was exactly what I needed. Then a second message arrived from an unknown number, and it was even shorter than the first threat, which made it more dangerous. It said, "We already have the security report template ready." By the time I got home, that last message had already done its work, because it didn't threaten me with fists or lawsuits or anything dramatic that makes a man feel brave. It threatened me with paperwork, which is the modern way to ruin someone without ever raising your voice. I stood in my kitchen and reread it until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like a process. And that was the moment I understood the plan wasn't to catch me doing something wrong. It was to manufacture a reasonable file that would survive scrutiny because it would be formatted correctly. Lena knew how to do that, and Derek knew how to enjoy it, and whoever was behind the committee's risk management knew how to make the story feel inevitable. I didn't answer the number because you never argue with a trap, and I didn't show Tessa the message right away either because she was still operating on instinct, and I needed her operating on strategy. But I did take my own screenshot. Then I photographed the screenshot on my screen beside today's newspaper on the counter, because I'd learned that a single digital image can be called fake by anyone with a confident tone, while a dated physical photo is harder to dismiss without looking desperate. I slid the printouts into clear sleeves, wrote the date on a label, and set them into the folder like I was assembling a medical chart, because in a way, that's what it was, a chart of a dying relationship and the people trying to harvest it. The next step had to be simple, clean, and lawful, because the enemy wanted me to look like the kind of man who overreacts, and the easiest way to prove them wrong is to do the opposite of what they expect. Paige had mentioned a prep meeting at the venue, and Lena's schedule had confirmed it without meaning to, which meant there would be an agenda, and if there was an agenda, there would be a header, and if there was a header, there would be a record of who wrote it and when. Paper doesn't love anyone, but it remembers. I didn't go as a husband demanding answers, because that would hand them the scene they were craving. So I went as what I actually was on paper, which was a donor spouse who had attended events before and had a valid reason to ask basic questions about seating and accessibility. I wore a jacket that made me look unremarkable. I kept my hands empty, and I parked far enough away that no one could claim I was lurking near the entrance. The venue was a church hall with a glossy floor and folding chairs stacked like obedient soldiers, and the smell of coffee and cleaning spray sat in the air the way it always does in places where people pretend everything is wholesome. The volunteer coordinator at the front table didn't recognize me at first, which was good, because recognition creates theater, but when she did, her smile tightened into the kind people use when they're trying to decide whether you're a threat or an inconvenience. I introduced myself politely, gave the name on my invitation, and asked who I should speak to about guest seating and any last-minute changes. And I watched the tiny flicker in her eyes when she said the committee chair was busy, but the board secretary could answer general questions. That phrase, general questions, sounded harmless, but it was a gate, and she had been told to keep it closed. The board secretary was an older woman named Judith, someone with calm hands and a pen that never stopped moving, and she looked like a person who had survived decades of petty power plays by refusing to react. I asked her if there was an updated seating chart or an updated agenda for donor arrivals, and I did it with the tone of a man who cares about logistics, not scandal, and she nodded as if she had been waiting for someone sensible to ask. She reached into a folder and pulled out a stack of printed pages, and I saw the header immediately, because once you're hunting for a header, you see them like bright flags. Judith didn't hand me the full packet, because she wasn't reckless, but she did slide a single page across the table and point to a section titled Guest Flow and Disruptions, and she called it a standard note that they used for every event. I pretended it was boring, because boring is camouflage, and I let my eyes move slowly down the bullet points until I saw the line that made my throat go tight. Because it didn't say, prevent disruptions. It said something closer to, manage spouse escalation. And beneath that was a subpoint about coordinating with security to document behavioral concerns for committee protection. I asked, still politely, what behavioral concerns meant in a church fundraiser context, and Judith's pen paused for half a second before she resumed moving, which told me she had been warned about this exact question. She said it referred to anyone who might arrive intoxicated or who might become aggressive, and she smiled slightly as if the explanation should satisfy me. But the smile didn't reach her eyes because she knew what this was too, even if she didn't like admitting it. I didn't argue, and I didn't demand the page because demands create resistance. But I did what I could do without crossing a line, which was to take out my phone and ask if I could photograph the page for my own reference, since I wanted to be sure I understood the flow and wouldn't bother volunteers on the night. Judith hesitated, then nodded, and she did it with the resignation of someone who realizes that refusing would look stranger than allowing. I took one photo, then another, making sure the header and date were visible, and then I thanked her, because gratitude disarms people who are waiting for hostility. As I turned to leave, I nearly walked straight into Lena, and I have to give her one thing. She had timing like a predator, because she appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and that practiced committee smile, as if she'd been born holding a list of names and pretending it was kindness. Behind her, Derek stood with a coffee cup he didn't need, leaning like he belonged there, and the sight of him in that hall, comfortable and smug, made my hands want to curl into fists even as my face stayed calm. Lena's eyes moved from my phone to Judith's folder to my expression, and for a second, the mask slipped, because she wasn't expecting me to be here without making noise. She asked what I was doing, and she asked it like she was addressing a misbehaving child, and I told her I was clarifying seating logistics so there wouldn't be confusion. And I watched her mind race because she couldn't call that unreasonable without sounding petty. Derek smiled and said it was good that I was being cooperative, and the word cooperative landed like a slap because it meant they had already decided what I was supposed to be. Lena stepped closer, lowered her voice, and said this was not the time for drama, and I told her I wasn't here for drama. I was here for information, because those were two very different things. Judith suddenly stood up, which surprised me, and she said she needed to speak with the chair about the updated packet, and she said it loudly enough for the nearby volunteers to hear, which meant she was either protecting herself or unintentionally giving me cover. Lena's posture stiffened, and Derek's smile flattened into something colder, because they didn't like witnesses when they weren't controlling the script. Lena tried to steer me toward the side hallway, the way someone tries to move an argument away from a crowd, but I didn't go, because I had promised myself I would never again follow her into a private corner where her version could become the only version. Instead, I asked her one simple question, still in that calm logistics voice, asking why the disruption plan specifically referenced spouse escalation, if this event was supposed to be community-focused and joyful. Lena blinked, and I watched her decide between two lies, and she chose the softer one, saying it was standard, that they had to plan for anything, that I shouldn't take it personally. Derek added that security was there to keep everyone safe, and he said it like a man who enjoyed the idea of security keeping me safe by removing me. I nodded as if I accepted it, because the goal wasn't to win an argument in a hallway, it was to gather proof that their plan existed and was premeditated. I thanked Judith again on my way out, and I caught the smallest look in her eyes as she watched Lena and Derek, a look that said she was tired of games and she didn't realize she had just handed me something that could not be unseen. Outside, I didn't get into my car right away because parking lots are where impulsive decisions happen, so I walked a block away to a bench where families were passing with grocery bags and no one cared who I was. I opened my photo roll, checked the images, and my pulse steadied as I saw the header and the language clear enough to read. Then I forwarded the images to my own email, because redundancy matters, and I wrote myself a plain note describing where and when I captured them, because memory is unreliable when adrenaline is involved. Then I called Tessa, and I told her I had something real, not a feeling, not an assumption, and we agreed to meet in an hour at the same library cafe, because it had worked once, and it would work again. When she arrived, she was already braced for bad news, but when I showed her the guest flow and disruptions page and the wording about documenting behavioral concerns, her anger turned into something sharper, because it wasn't just betrayal now, it was strategy, and strategy can be beaten with counter-strategy. Tessa asked if this meant they were going to try to get us thrown out, and I said yes, but I also said that if they were preparing templates, that meant there were other templates too, which meant there were standard forms and standard minutes and standard ways committees protect themselves. I told her we didn't have to storm the fundraiser like a pair of wounded animals, because that would feed them, but we could walk in like two adults with a thin folder and a plan to make the truth unavoidable. Tessa's mouth tightened, and she asked what exactly we would do, and I told her we would not argue with anyone, we would not shout, and we would not plead, because pleading makes you look guilty, and instead we would create a moment where a neutral person had to acknowledge a fact. As we talked, my phone buzzed again, and the number was the same unknown one, and for a moment I considered ignoring it completely. But curiosity can be a tool if you keep it on a leash. I opened the message, and it wasn't a threat this time, it was an image, a clean screenshot of a form with a bold title at the top, and even before I read the details, I recognized the structure of it, because it was exactly the kind of document you file after an incident. The name field was blank, but the incident description had placeholders already filled in, and the language was chillingly specific, mentioning raised voice, unwanted contact, and intimidating posture, like someone had rehearsed a performance they wanted to accuse me of delivering. Tessa leaned closer, saw the image, and let out a quiet sound that wasn't a sob but wasn't far from it, and she said that Derek had once used similar language in a text argument, accusing her of intimidating him when she asked a direct question. That was when the shape of the enemy sharpened again, because this wasn't just Lena and Derek freelancing, it was a shared playbook, a way of turning betrayed spouses into liabilities by labeling normal human reactions as threats. I stared at the screenshot and felt the strangest kind of calm settle into my chest, because once you see the mechanism, you stop fearing the noise and you start targeting the gears. I told Tessa we were going to treat that template like the confession it was, because it proved intent, and intent changes everything when someone later claims they were just reacting. I saved it, printed it at the library kiosk, signed and dated it, and slipped it into the folder behind the agenda photo, because now we had a pattern, a disruption plan in a committee packet, and an incident report template being circulated before anything had even happened. On the walk back to our cars, Tessa asked me what the next move was, and I told her the next move was to stop thinking of this as a marriage ending and start thinking of it as a public record being built. Because the only way to survive a manufactured narrative is to build a better one with boring proof. I told her we would enter that fundraiser with calm faces, we would choose our moment, and we would force their safety theater to collide with documentation they couldn't explain away. And then we would let the room do what rooms always do when faced with undeniable facts. It would turn. As I reached my car, I looked back once at the church hall doors, and I imagined Lena inside, practicing her smile, practicing her innocence, practicing the story she wanted the community to repeat, and I almost laughed, because she still believed the story belonged to whoever spoke first. Then my phone buzzed again, and the unknown number sent one final line that turned my blood colder than any insult ever could, because it said the security report template was not just ready, it was already pre-approved, and it included the name of the person who had signed off on it. It wasn't a security manager, and it wasn't a volunteer. It was Judith. By the time I got home, my hands were steady, which was how I knew I was scared, because fear doesn't always make you shake. Sometimes it makes you quiet and careful, like you're walking through a room full of glass. I sat at the kitchen table and laid the evidence out the way I used to lay out reports when I still believed procedure meant protection, with the agenda page, the incident template screenshot, and the printout I'd signed at the library kiosk because signatures turn a feeling into a record. I added a new sheet on top, a simple timeline written in black ink, and I wrote the day, the time, and what happened in neutral language that didn't accuse anyone of being evil, because neutral language survives when people start calling you emotional. The name at the bottom of that message kept flashing in my mind like a hazard light. Judith. The board secretary who had acted cautious, who had looked tired, who had let me photograph the page like she was doing me a small favor, and who, according to the text, had pre-approved the template designed to paint me as a threat. Either the message was lying to provoke me into blaming the wrong person, or Judith was wearing two faces and had shown me the softer one because it made me drop my guard. I didn't know which was true, but I knew the rule that matters when you're dealing with a trap. You never treat the bait as proof, but you always treat it as a lead. Tessa called as I was stapling the papers into chronological order, and her voice was tight, like she was holding back a storm so it wouldn't scare her own kids in the next room. She told me she'd looked up Derek's wife, the woman I'd spoken to earlier, and her name was Mariah, and she worked for a local nonprofit that partnered with the fundraiser committee for community outreach. That detail landed with weight, because it meant Mariah wasn't just a betrayed spouse. She was a hinge between social circles, a person who could get you shut out without ever raising her voice. It also meant Derek and Lena hadn't picked their targets randomly, because people like them never do. They pick people who will keep quiet out of embarrassment, and they build safety nets out of other people's reputations. I told Tessa about Judith, and there was a long pause, the kind where someone is running through every interaction in their mind and rescoring it for danger. Then Tessa said something I hadn't considered, which was that pre-approved didn't necessarily mean Judith was the mastermind. It could mean the committee had a routine, a procedural habit of approving templates for incidents in advance because they were obsessed with controlling optics. The difference mattered, because if Judith was a co-conspirator, she would protect Lena, but if Judith was a procedure addict, she might protect the committee first, which meant she could be turned with the right pressure. I didn't like the word turned because it sounded like I was doing something dirty, but in reality, it meant giving someone a chance to choose the clean option. I slept maybe 2 hours, and when I woke up, I did what calm people do when they are trying not to panic. I made coffee, packed a lunch I didn't eat, and made a list of questions that would sound harmless to anyone overhearing them. I wrote them on paper, not in my phone, because phones get lost and screens get accused, but paper sits on a table and looks like what it is. Then I drove to the church hall again, not to confront anyone, but to make the story real in my mind, because the best way to keep yourself from reacting badly later is to rehearse the environment now, like a firefighter walking a building before the alarm. The hall was busier this time, with volunteers moving boxes, a caterer in a hairnet carrying trays, and a security contractor standing near the entrance with a clipboard, and the bored posture of a man paid to look alert. I didn't walk straight in like I owned the place, because people mistake confidence for aggression when they want an excuse. So I waited, watched the rhythm, and then went to the volunteer table like a man with a simple problem. The volunteer coordinator looked up and recognized me, and I saw the flash of annoyance she tried to hide, because she'd been told to expect me, which meant the net was tightening. I asked for Judith in a low voice and said I had a question about accessibility seating for a family member with limited mobility, which was true enough to count as truth, because my mother's knees had been ruined by years of work and pride, and she would never ask for special seating even if she needed it. The coordinator hesitated, then waved me toward the side door and said Judith was inside preparing the packets. I thanked her and walked carefully, keeping my phone in my pocket, because I didn't want to look like a man filming his own paranoia. Judith was at a folding table with stacks of programs and name tags laid out like a factory line. She looked up when I approached, and her face did something small and complicated, like a flicker of sympathy fighting a flicker of caution. I introduced myself again, politely, and asked if I could speak with her for a minute about the wording I'd seen in the guest flow note, because I didn't want to misunderstand it and accidentally violate any committee rules. That phrasing was intentional. Misunderstand makes you sound responsible, while accuse makes you sound unstable. Judith's pen paused just like before, and she asked what wording I meant, which told me she was trying to force me to say it out loud first, so she could judge whether I was going to make a scene. I didn't say spouse escalation, and I didn't say behavioral concerns, because those were loaded phrases that could be twisted. So I asked about the incident reporting process, and I asked whether there was a standard form volunteers were expected to use if someone complained about harassment or intimidation. Judith's mouth tightened, not with anger, but with discomfort, like she was swallowing something sour. She said yes, there were standard forms, and yes, they were approved ahead of time, because it was safer to be prepared. I nodded and asked who approved them, and I said it like I was curious about committee structure, not about betrayal. Judith told me that templates were reviewed by the chair and the risk lead, and then signed off by the secretary for filing consistency. She said it like she was reciting a policy, because policy is the language she lived in. I asked who the risk lead was, and Judith told me the name. Lena. There it was, clean and simple, the way truth often is when you stop chasing drama and start chasing roles. I didn't react, because I didn't want Judith to see triumph. I wanted her to see seriousness. I asked whether those templates were ever customized in advance for specific situations, and Judith's eyes narrowed a fraction, because now she heard what I was really asking. She said no. Templates were general, and anything specific would be written at the time of the incident by whoever witnessed it. I let that answer sit, and then I asked softly whether she considered it appropriate for a risk lead to circulate a draft incident description before an event even began, because that sounded less like preparedness and more like scripting. Judith's face went still, and in that stillness I saw the exhaustion again, the tiredness of someone who was used to cleaning up other people's messes with paperwork. She didn't deny it immediately, which was the first crack. She asked where I had heard that, and I told her I had received a screenshot from an unknown number, and I said I wasn't claiming it was real, but I was taking it seriously because it contained language that could harm someone if it was being weaponized. I kept my voice flat and professional, like a man reporting a hazard, because that's what it was, a hazard to the committee's integrity. Judith exhaled slowly, and she said something that sounded like half a confession and half a warning, telling me that people in committees sometimes got overzealous about risk and optics, and that she had insisted on standard language for consistency. Then she asked me, very carefully, whether I had the screenshot with me. I didn't pull out my phone right away, because desperation makes you sloppy, so I asked her if she was asking in an official capacity or out of personal concern, because I wanted the line drawn clean. Judith looked down at her papers and said she was asking, because if someone was circulating fake committee documents, the committee needed to know, and if someone was circulating real committee documents inappropriately, the committee needed to know even more. That was the opening. I took out my phone, opened the image, and held it so Judith could see, not so she could grab it, because grabbing would turn it into a scuffle, and I refused to give them that. Judith leaned in, read the language, and her eyes tightened in anger, not at me, but at the audacity of the template being filled in with behavior descriptors before anything happened. She murmured that this was not how it was supposed to work, and I watched her flip into the only mode she trusted: procedure. She asked me to forward the image to the committee email, and she said she would log it as a concern, and she said it with a tone that was almost cold, which meant she was protecting herself too. I told her I would forward it, but only if she confirmed in writing that she had requested it and that it would be treated as a policy issue, not a personal dispute, because I wasn't handing ammunition to people who wanted to frame me. Judith hesitated, then nodded, and she reached for a pad and wrote a short note with the date and her signature, stating she had asked me to provide the screenshot for committee review due to potential misuse of incident reporting. She tore the page off and handed it to me, and I felt a strange surge of relief, because paper has weight, and weight means reality. As I slid Judith's signed note into my folder, I noticed something on the table beside the name tags, a stack of printed introductions for the host, which included a line about recognizing community partners and special guests. Judith saw my eyes move and quickly placed her hand over the stack like a reflex, and that reflex told me there was something in those introductions they didn't want me reading. I didn't reach for it, and I didn't ask directly, because direct questions trigger defenses, but I asked whether seating and introductions were already finalized, since the host script seemed printed. Judith said yes, most of it was finalized, and she said it like a person trying to end a conversation before it turned dangerous. I thanked her, kept my face calm, and walked out without lingering, because leaving while you still have control is a kind of power. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and read Judith's note 3 times, because it gave me something I could use later if they claimed I was harassing committee members, and it also gave me something else, something more important. It proved Judith was not fully on Lena's side. She might be cautious, she might be complicit in routine approvals, but she didn't like being used, and people who don't like being used will sometimes do the right thing when the stakes get public. On the drive home, my phone buzzed again, and this time the message wasn't from the unknown number, it was from Mariah. The first line made my stomach drop, because she wrote that she had heard I'd been circling the venue and pressuring volunteers, and she wanted to clear the air before things got ugly. That language wasn't hers, not really. It was committee language, optics language, the same kind that turns a man asking questions into a man making threats. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, stared at the message, and felt the trap tighten again, because now they were pre-framing me through Derek's wife, which meant they were moving faster than I wanted. I typed a reply with 1 sentence, kept it calm, and asked Mariah to meet me in a public place with Tessa present, so everything stayed respectful and clear. I hit send, then sat back and watched the screen like it might blink and tell me what to do next. A minute later, Mariah answered with a location and time. The cafe near the community center, today, in 2 hours. And then she added a final line that made my pulse spike because she said she was bringing someone from the committee so nobody could claim she was misrepresenting anything. I stared at that line, imagining Lena walking in with her smile and her script, and I realized the next conversation wasn't going to be private anymore because they were dragging witnesses into it on purpose. I put the phone down, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, and forced myself to breathe, because the only way to survive a staged scene is to refuse to act like the villain they wrote. Then the unknown number pinged 1 more time, and the message was short, surgical, and cruel. It said the committee representative Mariah was bringing was not Lena. It was Derek. I sat in my car outside the cafe and watched the door like it was the mouth of a trap that hadn't decided whether to bite. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and people moved behind the glass in soft, casual shapes, laughing with the kind of ease you can only have when your life is not being edited by someone else. I checked my folder again, even though I already knew what was in it, because routine is a pressure valve, and I needed the hiss in my head to stop. Judith's signed note was there, my printed timeline was there, and the screenshot was there, sitting like a loaded gun that only fired paper. Tessa arrived first, which was what I expected, because she was the only person in this whole mess who understood the difference between drama and leverage. She walked up with her chin slightly raised, calm in a way that was not natural, which meant she had decided to be calm as a weapon. She got into the passenger seat, looked at the folder on my lap, and asked if I was ready. I told her I was ready to listen, and that made her snort quietly, because she knew listening was the sharpest thing I did. We went in together and chose a table near the back, not hidden, but not center stage, because being seen is not the same as being displayed. The cafe smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon, and the sound of the grinder came in waves like a heartbeat you couldn't control. I set my phone face down on the table, not recording, not performing, just present, because I didn't want anyone claiming I was trying to ambush them with technology. Instead, I put a small notebook beside my cup, the kind with a cheap spiral binding, and I clicked a pen once, a simple sound that said I was taking notes like this was a meeting, not a fight. Mariah walked in exactly on time, which told me she had rehearsed the timing, and she wasn't alone. Derek was beside her, dressed like he was heading to a business lunch, with a jacket too expensive for a casual cafe, and the polished confidence of a man who believes his choices never come with consequences. He looked at me and smiled a little, the kind of smile that tries to make you feel small for having feelings, and behind that smile I could see a flicker of something else, something like annoyance that his day had been interrupted. Mariah's expression was composed, almost bright, but her eyes stayed sharp, scanning Tessa, scanning me, scanning the room, as if she was checking for cameras, witnesses, or the possibility of humiliation. They approached, and I stood up politely because manners are not weakness, they are a shield. Derek extended his hand to Tessa first, like he was trying to control the social frame, and she shook it without smiling, her grip firm enough to tell him she wasn't impressed. Mariah nodded at me and sat down across from us, and Derek took the chair beside her with the casual entitlement of a man who thinks every room is his. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I let the silence sit, because silence forces people to fill it with their true intentions, and Derek was not a patient man. He leaned back, crossed his ankle over his knee, and said he was here because Mariah asked him to be, and because there had been a lot of confusion about what I had been saying. He said confusion the way someone says rumor, as if the facts were floating without owners, as if my life had become a messy story people could shrug at. I nodded and said I appreciated him coming, and I said I wanted everything to stay respectful and clear, because I wasn't interested in shouting matches or public scenes. I watched Mariah's face as I spoke, because she was the one who had to live with Derek after this, and I needed to know whether she was looking for truth or looking for control. Her lips pressed together slightly, and she gave a small nod, like she was agreeing to a code of conduct. Derek said he had heard I was accusing him of something inappropriate, and he asked what exactly I believed he had done. He emphasized believe, like he was already building the defense that I was emotional and ungrounded. I looked at him and told him I wasn't interested in belief. I was interested in dates, places, and documented contradictions. I saw a small twitch in his jaw, because men like him hate when you refuse to play the game of outrage. Mariah cut in, her voice sweet and sharp, and said she didn't want a lecture on documentation. She wanted to know why I had approached her at the fundraiser setup and dropped a grenade into her marriage. She used the word grenade, which was dramatic enough to make the nearby table glance over, and that told me she was not as calm as she wanted to appear. I kept my face neutral and said I approached her because I had discovered that my wife had been seeing her husband, and that I believed she deserved to know before she got blindsided in public. I didn't use the word affair yet, because I was watching the temperature, and words like that can turn a conversation into a brawl. Derek chuckled, a short sound meant to signal disbelief, and he said my wife was a friend, and that I was misreading things because I was stressed. The word friend was a weapon because it sounded innocent while insulting my intelligence. Tessa leaned forward slightly and asked Derek to keep his answers specific because vague words were easy to hide behind. Derek looked at her like he was evaluating whether she mattered, then shrugged as if he was indulging a child. I opened my notebook and wrote the date of today's meeting at the top, then I wrote the time, and I said out loud that I was taking notes so nobody could later claim the conversation went differently. Mariah's eyes flicked to the notebook, and something like relief flashed there, because the notebook wasn't a phone, and a notebook feels like accountability, not surveillance. Derek's smile tightened, because he preferred conversations that evaporated. I asked Derek one question, slowly, and I asked it the way you ask someone at the bank to confirm your name, calm and procedural. I asked whether he had been with my wife on the Tuesday 2 weeks ago when he told Mariah he was at the volunteer committee meeting. Derek blinked once, then said yes. He had been at the committee meeting, and he said it with the confidence of someone reciting a prepared line. Mariah turned her head toward him, her eyes searching his face, and I saw the strain there, the effort of a woman trying to keep her world intact through sheer will. I nodded and said I wasn't claiming anything about that night yet, but I had a simple concern about the committee meeting itself. I told them that earlier in the week I had received confirmation that the committee did not meet that Tuesday because the session had been canceled due to a venue scheduling issue, and I said I could show them the email header I had been forwarded by a volunteer coordinator who believed in transparency. I didn't actually show the email yet, because showing too early triggers denial, but saying it exists forces people to choose their next lie carefully. Derek's eyes narrowed, and he asked who had told me that. He didn't deny the cancellation, he demanded a source, which was telling. I said I wasn't here to expose volunteer names, and I wasn't here to target anyone in the committee, but I was willing to share documented proof in a way that protected the people who had done nothing wrong. Mariah's gaze sharpened, and she asked Derek again, quietly, whether the meeting had been canceled. Derek answered too fast and said it must have been moved, and he said it like the word moved could erase the problem. Tessa asked where it had been moved to, and Derek hesitated just long enough to show he didn't have a location prepared. He said it had been moved to a smaller room at the community center, and he waved vaguely as if the geography didn't matter. I looked at him and said the community center was closed that evening for maintenance, and I said it because Tessa had checked, because she always checked. Derek's face flushed slightly, and he tried to smile again, but this time the smile didn't land. Mariah's eyes widened a fraction, and I saw a hairline crack run through her composure. Mariah asked him why he was lying, and she didn't raise her voice, which made the question more dangerous. Derek's posture changed, his shoulders shifting forward, and he said he wasn't lying, he was just mixing up dates because he had a lot going on. It was a familiar excuse, the kind people use when they want you to accept confusion as a substitute for truth. I leaned forward and told him I wasn't asking him to remember the whole month. I was asking him one date, one time, one place. Derek's gaze snapped to me, and for a second, the mask slipped, revealing irritation that wasn't just defensive, but controlling. He said he didn't owe me answers, and he said that if I had marital problems, I should deal with my wife instead of dragging him into it. That line was designed to shame me back into silence, to push the conflict back into the private space where he could keep doing whatever he wanted. I didn't react, because reaction is what people like him feed on, and instead I asked Mariah whether she had received any messages from Derek that night, mentioning the meeting, the delay, or any logistical issue, because if a meeting was moved, there would usually be a text. Mariah looked down at her hands, and I could see her calculating whether looking at her phone would make her look weak. Then she picked it up anyway, scrolled, and her face went still. She didn't find a moved meeting message, and she didn't have to say it out loud because her silence said it. Derek leaned toward her, trying to see her screen, and she turned it away, and that small motion was another crack. I slid my notebook toward the center of the table and wrote 2 short lines. Then I turned it so Mariah could read without me narrating. The lines were simple. Tuesday, 7:40 p.m., and then a note about my wife's alibi that matched Derek's. I didn't include names, because I wasn't performing. I was building a shared reality. Mariah stared at the notebook, then lifted her eyes to Derek, and her voice came out colder when she asked how my wife's schedule could match his if they weren't together. Derek's mouth opened, then closed, and he did the thing all liars do when the room stops believing them, which is they try to change the subject to my behavior. He said I was stalking the committee, that I was harassing volunteers, that I was showing up and making people uncomfortable. The words were familiar, the same language I had seen in that screenshot, and hearing them out loud made my stomach tighten, because now I knew the template wasn't just a draft. It was a script being performed on demand. Tessa's eyes flashed, and she asked Derek if he even understood how obvious he was being, repeating phrasing that sounded like it came from an official document. Derek glared at her, and Mariah's expression shifted sharply, because she heard it too now, the unnatural phrasing, the rehearsed cadence. I reached into my folder slowly, with no sudden movements, and I placed Judith's signed note on the table, sliding it toward Mariah like a peace offering. I told Mariah that I had met with the board secretary earlier that day and that she had asked me to provide the screenshot for committee review because it appeared someone was pre-filling an incident narrative. I didn't say Lena's name yet, but I watched Derek's face, and when his eyes flicked away, I knew he already knew exactly who it was. Mariah picked up the note, read it, and her fingers tightened around the paper, because paper is hard to dismiss. For the first time, Derek looked uneasy, not angry, but exposed. He leaned in and lowered his voice, and he said this was bigger than me, bigger than Mariah, and bigger than whatever my wife had done, and he said people had reputations to protect. He didn't say whose reputations, but he didn't need to. Mariah stared at him and asked what he meant, and Derek hesitated again, and in that hesitation, I felt something shift in the air, the sense that we had reached the edge of the real story. I asked Derek one more question, and I asked it softly, because soft questions force loud truths. I asked him whether Lena had instructed him to come here today and frame me as a threat in front of his wife, so she could justify barring me from the gala and controlling what got recorded in the minutes. Derek's eyes snapped to mine, and for a second, the cafe noise faded behind the blood in my ears, because his silence was not denial. It was calculation. Mariah's face changed in a slow, terrible way, like she was watching the floor vanish beneath her. She whispered Lena's name as if it tasted bitter, and Derek finally exhaled, the sound rough and defeated, and he said Lena had said it was the only way to keep everything from becoming a scandal. He said he didn't want Mariah humiliated. He said he didn't want the nonprofit harmed, and he said he thought if he helped manage the situation, it would blow over. I didn't smile, and I didn't gloat, because this wasn't victory. It was confirmation. I looked at Mariah and told her I hadn't come here to beg for sympathy. I had come here to make sure the truth landed on record before Lena could bury it under procedure. Mariah swallowed hard, and she asked me what I wanted. The question was raw, because it carried another question beneath it, the real one. What do we do now when we finally know? I looked at the folder, then at the cafe door, then back at Mariah, and I said, I wanted the same thing Lena wanted, except mine didn't require lying. I wanted the gala to happen. I wanted the community to see exactly who was steering the room, and I wanted the minutes to reflect the truth, not a script. I told Mariah that if she was willing, she could stop this from being a private war and turn it into a public correction, the kind that leaves no space for gaslighting later. Mariah's eyes were wet now, but her voice was steady when she asked how. I didn't answer immediately, because timing matters, and because the next step was the kind that would set fire to every bridge at once. I reached into my folder, pulled out the screenshot, and placed it face down on the table, not showing it yet, just letting its presence speak. Then I said the words I had been saving for the end, the words that made Derek's throat tighten and made Mariah's eyes widen with dread. I told them Lena had built a stage for tonight, and I was done letting her decide who played the villain, because at the gala, in front of witnesses, I was going to force the record to choose. I walked into the gala as the lights softened and the room settled, and I watched Lena's smile tighten when the board secretary placed my sealed sleeve on the table. The facilitator read one line from the minutes, evidence received, and Derek's face drained as Mariah stood beside me and confirmed the timeline was real. My wife tried to laugh it off, but the silence made her voice sound guilty. not confident. Lena reached for control, yet the policy line she once used became the blade that cut her power. When the vote landed and the sponsor withdrawal notice was read, my wife finally understood that I was not begging anymore.